After the death of my husband, the rights to the inheritance belonged to my daughter and me. So my brother, Jack, can't claim any of it. However, Jack didn't understand what it meant. Sarah and I are all set to move. We're just about ready to move in. I agreed to sell our house because I was told we could get your brother-in-law's house. But this is not what we heard. It was a loud, shrill voice. Perhaps because of that, Abby inside the house might have noticed what was happening at the entrance. I could hear her coming down the stairs from the second floor, wondering what was going on. I cannot involve my daughter in this. Moreover, I want to avoid any further disputes with my husband's family. Above all, there's also the issue with our house. While I was thinking about this, Abby had already reached the entrance. Spotting her, Jack seemed to have found someone he could persuade. With a happy look on his face, Jack began to elaborately explain how pitiful their situation was and how they could be saved. Seeking sympathy. At first, Abby listened with a skeptical look, but gradually her expression turned pale. And finally, she spoke up. "Uncle, don't you know about?" I stopped Abby from saying something more. I didn't want to make the situation worse. Moreover, it was clear they wouldn't listen to anything we said at this point. Understood. Please feel free to do as you wish. My name is Cindy. I'm a 44-year-old who works at a local travel agency. Being married with a daughter, I'm also doing my best as a homemaker while working. My husband, who was the same age as me, was a very gentle and calm person. He never got angry or made a fuss. Moreover, he was the type to immediately offer help when someone around him needed it. A caretaker by nature. I have always loved this about him since we were dating. We met over 20 years ago at a social gathering. I had a prejudice that social gatherings were filled with frivolous, noisy, and selfish people, so I wasn't keen on participating. A friend brought me there as a filler somewhat insistently. I wasn't enthusiastic, so I went with minimal makeup and casual clothes. At the venue, I planned to just eat and stay out of the way. Among the attendees, one man caught my eye. He was serving salad and attending to the drunk people with dedication. His considerate behavior made a good impression on me, despite little interest in the opposite gender. I mustered up the courage to talk to him, and surprisingly, we hit it off. He readily exchanged contact information with me and even arranged our next meeting. Even upon meeting him again, he remained the wonderful person I first met. With support from those around us, his proposal led to our marriage. Our marriage didn't turn into one of those horror stories where the man changes for the worse. It was peaceful. Soon after, our daughter Abby was born. She is the most precious thing to us. He was thrilled with our first child, his usual charming smile even brighter, almost brimming with joy. Returning to work shortly, we shared household and childcare responsibilities equally. We respected each other and managed to raise our child smoothly. Marrying and raising a child is challenging. But my husband's kindness has always been my salvation. That's why, from Abby's birth until now, we've been able to spend peaceful days together. Our beloved daughter turns 20 this year. I might be biased, but I think Abby has grown into a kind and considerate young woman. Just like her father. She talks to her classmates without discrimination, is well regarded by her teachers, and even greets elderly people on the street. Like her father, her excessive kindness worries me. So far, there have been no major issues. And Abby has been able to continue attending college without any problems. Abby is still commuting from home to university, but I expect she will become independent in a few more years. I thought that life would continue as usual with my husband and me after that. My daughter's coming-of-age ceremony had just ended peacefully at the end of January, and I was relieved when a major incident struck our family. What happened to you? My husband suddenly collapsed at the entrance, right before leaving for work. I felt a little off about him today. He himself said he felt a bit breathless right after waking up. But other than that, he was his usual self. I was preparing our usual breakfast and leisurely getting ready for work as well. I hadn't thought it would be serious enough for him to collapse. In my confusion, I hurriedly called an ambulance and accompanied him to the hospital. He had suffered a heart attack. How could this happen? I was so confused, I hardly knew what I was saying. It might have been close to a scream. Dad. Abby, who had been out overnight, rushed back, gasping for breath. In the cold hospital corridor, my daughter and I sat on a sofa, desperately praying for my husband's safety. The doctors seemed to do everything they could, wisely. Despite their efforts, my husband quickly passed away. I felt a great despair when the doctor with a somber face came out of the treatment room. Don't leave me. Abby kept stroking my back as I cried in the hospital room. The warmth of her hand warmed my frozen spine. Mom, I'm with you. Her voice was gentle, like my husband's used to be. I always thought of my child as a child, no matter how old she got. But seeing her trying to comfort me, despite her own grief, made me realize how much she had grown. Perhaps it was due to Abby's encouragement that I managed to shift my feelings slightly afterward. Thanks to Abby, I was also able to arrange the funeral smoothly. At the funeral, I received many words of consolation and sympathy from my husband's relatives. I continued with the ceremony of parting with my husband, grateful for each word. The ceremony was hard, and I nearly broke down many times during the funeral. But thanks to Abby and those around us, I managed to finish it. Not only Abby and my husband's relatives were concerned about my depressed state. During the funeral, as I was mentally vulnerable, my parents reached out to me, worried. They told me to come back home. It may not be the right thing to say in such a situation, but seeing my state, they thought it would be safer for Abby and me to temporarily stay at my parents' house. I was too sunk in grief over my husband's death to even consider it. Moreover, it had been over 20 years since I got married and left home. I wanted some time to think, so I declined my parents' offer at that time. And so, I quickly became known as a widow. Being a widow might give the impression of financial instability. However, I worked as a full-time employee, so I had less worry about income. Abby was a top student, which meant her university tuition fees were partially waived, which helped a lot. However, a new problem arose shortly after the commotion. It emerged while Abby and I were settling the inheritance and other aftermaths. It was the first time I sighed over an issue caused by my late husband. What should we do about living from now on? As someone who deeply loved my husband, the shock was immense. Yet, I understood that my daughter, Abby, and those around us were always on my side. I decided to confront this issue head-on and think it through. Determined, about 2 months passed when suddenly, a car parked in front of our house without warning. It was my day off, so I noticed that. I was surprised, but went to the entrance. I recognized the dirty, damaged car and its number plate. The car was recklessly parked close to the garage in the garden. Likely due to this, the bricks of the flower bed I had made were slightly chipped. The situation clearly showed that the car had entered at a considerable speed and was parked forcefully. Jack, what brings you here? The unexpected visitor was Jack, the brother of my late husband, with his long, damaged blonde hair looking even more faded than it was at the funeral. I hadn't noticed at the funeral, since he was dressed in mourning clothes. But now he appeared to be wearing a very worn-out t-shirt as his everyday attire. As he got out of the car, he said something shocking right away. "Cindy, I'm taking over this house. Pack your stuff and leave right now." I couldn't understand what he was talking about. This house was built with the savings my husband and I had put together after getting married. It was not Jack's family home. Jack, who had been independent by the time I married, had never lived in this house. Not even as a guest. Moreover, other than for ceremonial occasions, our households had little to do with each other. After my husband's death, the rights to the inheritance belonged to my daughter and me. So Jack, being the brother, had no claim to it. However, Jack didn't seem to understand this common sense. I can understand about Abby, but it's only natural that I, as his brother, have more rights than a sister-in-law who isn't related by blood. Jack continued, explaining his current situation. He said he had accumulated too much debt and had to sell his home, leaving him without a place to live. He insisted he had the right to inherit part of his brother's estate. That reminded me. Jack was known to have a gambling problem, which my kind husband had criticized. I hadn't paid much attention during my husband's funeral because I was too distraught. However, my husband had mentioned that Jack had even sought financial assistance from his family. I believe it was the day after a family memorial service that only my husband attended. Jack apparently begged for money from not only his parents, but also his brother, my husband, and other relatives, which was quite shameful. My husband never spoke ill of anyone. So I was surprised and a bit scared to hear him speak like this about Jack. It was a completely different character from my husband, who was a bundle of kindness and naivety. This was all because my husband, as the eldest son, was raised very strictly, while Jack, who was frail as a child, was seldom scolded or reprimanded. The in-laws never intended to raise them differently. But perhaps this led Jack to become an adult who couldn't discipline himself. That's what some relatives suggested. Now, Jack, with a menacing look, was standing before me. Even if you say such things suddenly, this house is. I was bewildered by this demand, which was neither sensible nor legal. However, Jack cut off my words and continued. Sarah and I have finished preparing for the move. We're just ready to move in. He forcefully pushed the conversation. After a while, another person got out of the car, a middle-aged woman walking in high heels. Though we had no interaction outside of ceremonial occasions, I immediately recognized her as Sarah, Jack's wife. I had heard from my husband's relatives that she had a habit of buying lottery tickets worth nearly $500 every chance she got. Her excuse was always to make up for my husband's losses. The entire family was furious, calling it wasteful. Sarah joined the argument, backing up Jack. I agreed to sell our house because I was told we could have your brother-in-law's house. This is not what we agreed on. It was a loud, shrill voice. Because of that, Abby inside the house must have noticed what was happening at the entrance. I could hear her coming down the stairs from the second floor, wondering what was going on. I cannot involve my daughter in this. Moreover, I want to avoid any further disputes with my husband's family. Above all, there's also the issue with our house. While I was thinking about this, Abby had already reached the entrance. Startled by the sudden appearance of her uncle, she couldn't hide her surprise. Seeing Abby, Jack must have thought he found someone he could persuade. With a happy look on his face, Jack began to elaborately explain how pitiful their situation was, and how they could be saved, seeking sympathy. At first, Abby listened with a skeptical look, but gradually her expression turned pale. And finally, she spoke up. Jack, don't you know? I stopped Abby from saying more. I didn't want to escalate the situation further. It was clear they wouldn't listen to anything we said at this point. Understood. Please feel free to do as you wish. While restraining Abby, who was shocked, I informed Jack and his wife that we would vacate the house within a month. They seemed pleased, believing their demands had been met. Obviously, moving out immediately, both physically and mentally, was challenging, so we requested some time. This seemed to improve Jack and Sarah's mood. As their proposal to take over the house was accepted, they agreed to leave for the day, and I returned inside with Abby. As soon as the front door closed, Abby frowned and said, "Mom, even saying such a thing." Abby was worried, but I had a plan. I quietly shared it with her. Listening attentively, Abby agreed to cooperate with the plan. We decided to leave the house voluntarily. I would return to my parents' home, as they had suggested. As for Abby, living in an apartment for one was the decision, since commuting to university from my parents' house would become impractical. Though I wished she could stay with me, I understood that dropping out of university was not an option. Moreover, she had dreams and goals she wanted to achieve at university. I had always communicated the challenges of living alone, but she seemed determined. So, I immediately called my parents. Abby quickly started looking for student apartments on her smartphone. My parents agreed to take me back, and luckily, we found an available apartment for Abby right away. Additionally, finding a moving service for both of us was surprisingly easy due to it being an off-peak season. Despite the abruptness of our move, everything went smoothly. Thus, Abby and I left the house filled with memories of my husband. One day, after settling into our new lives, the phone rang at my parents' house. Not recognizing the number and hesitant due to the prevalence of scam calls targeting the elderly, I reluctantly answered after it kept ringing. "Cindy." The moment I put the receiver to my ear, a booming voice came through, recognizable as Jack's yelling. "They said they'd call the police if we stayed in your house." "What's this all about?" Jack sounded panicked, confused to the point of incoherence. After calming him down, I listened to his story. Somewhat calmed, Jack explained that after we left, they moved into the house as planned. Initially, everything seemed fine as he and Sarah settled in. However, soon an unknown real estate agency showed up, claiming the house was listed for sale and threatening to charge them with trespassing if they didn't leave. They even had a master key. When Jack protested, saying there must be a mistake or it was a scam, the agency threatened to call the police. I sighed deeply after hearing the story and responded, "Yes, the house has been sold. It should be listed as a second-hand home by the real estate agency, as they said." Jack was stunned on the other end of the call. I could hear Sarah asking what was going on in the background. "What are you lying for?" he shouted again. I wasn't lying. Had indeed sold the house. The contract to vacate had been completed just before Jack and Sarah's visit. The issue discovered after my husband's death was his debt, unknown to me until we began the inheritance proceedings. Though aware that inheritances could include debts, I never imagined it would affect us so directly. My husband, before he passed, seems to have become a guarantor for an acquaintance's debt. I heard from a friend of my husband that as soon as this acquaintance secured the loan with my husband's backing, they vanished without a trace, leaving my husband with the responsibility to repay. Documents demanding payment from the creditors were discovered among his belongings. Whether my husband had willingly signed to help his friend out of goodness, or was coerced into it, remains a mystery shrouded in darkness. Given my husband's kind-hearted nature, the former seems more likely, though this act of kindness ultimately became a heavy burden. Faced with a substantial amount of debt, the solution wasn't straightforward. Even though I was working and Abby's tuition wasn't exorbitantly high. Upon consulting with my parents, they suggested, "Why not sell the house and come back home? We're always here to welcome you." This was a reiteration of their previous advice during my period of grief following my husband's death. After our family became one person smaller, I began to feel more positive about selling our home, which now felt too spacious. I realized I couldn't dwell on the shock forever. With my daughter, Abby, now a college student and an adult, I thought it might be a good time to start anew. That's why I agreed with my parents' suggestion. Whether Abby would come with me or live on her own wasn't decided until just before the move. By the time Jack and Sarah came to claim the house, the sale had already been finalized. In essence, the house was no longer mine at that point. This was not what I was informed about. I tried to discuss the ownership of the house with you at that time. Jack and Sarah, having not listened to our side of the story, insisted the house was rightfully theirs. Anticipating such a scenario, I had already decided on moving back with my parents and confirming Abby's intentions for her independent living, vacating the house without further discussion. This was the subtle plan I had devised. Reflecting on it, a more thorough approach to the house transfer could have prevented this mishap. However, Jack and Sarah's carefree attitude, without proper legal documentation or confirmation, led to their abrupt eviction under the law. In the end, their reliance on the real estate company was futile, and they were nearly reported to the police, narrowly avoiding a criminal record but forcibly removed. Having already disposed of their property, they had nowhere to return. They attempted to seek refuge with Jack's parents and relatives, burdened with their belongings. However, their well-known financial recklessness, particularly Jack's gambling addiction, led to a unanimous rejection from the family, including my in-laws. Attempts were made to seek help from us, but lacking knowledge of my whereabouts or Abby's university and living arrangements, they found no aid. This ensured we had no concern about being pursued by them. Faced with desperation and no apparent solution, Jack and Sarah perhaps resorted to squandering their last resources on gambling and lotteries, only to face utter defeat. Despite their looking down on a homeless lifestyle, or living modestly on government or local assistance, they couldn't abandon their aversion to it, resorting to loan sharks and stubbornly repeating their gambling and lottery habits led them back into a pit of debt. This time, dealing with loan sharks meant they couldn't easily dodge their responsibilities as before. This information came to me during an apology session arranged by my late husband's parents, the in-laws. They expressed their deepest regrets about the entire ordeal, indicating they had lost track of them and hadn't heard any news since. Even the in-laws couldn't trace their whereabouts, receiving no calls or pleas for money lately. This silence somewhat reveals their current plight. It's heartbreaking to see my husband's family fall into such dire circumstances. The in-laws' grief must be even more profound. They lamented overindulging their younger son due to his frail health in childhood, which inadvertently led to this crisis. Moreover, they mourned the tragedy caused by their eldest son's kindness, which ultimately burdened their granddaughter. They even went as far as to offer a deep bow of apology to Abby and me, affirming they would never assist Jack again, regardless of the circumstances. Honestly, at first, I had some concerns about my in-laws who were at the center of these events. However, after seeing the sincerity in their eyes, I realized I still wanted to maintain a good relationship with them going forward. They prioritized the well-being of Abby and me and handled everything so thoughtfully, which I am extremely grateful for. Although my husband is no longer with us, Abby and I promised to visit his parents regularly. Abby adores both my parents and my husband's, so she's very happy about this. As for me, moving back home meant I had to quit my job. While it's not impossible to commute to my daughter's university from there, I'm also of an age where pushing myself too hard isn't wise. So, I've decided against enduring long commutes. My colleagues and superiors reached out to me after my husband's death and the sale of our house, but their concern is unnecessary. I've found a job that allows for remote work, leveraging my previous experience in a similar field. Now, I'm working from a room in my parents' house. Working from home is still somewhat unfamiliar, but I'm gradually getting used to this new lifestyle. Abby and I keep in touch regularly. Despite the uncertainties of starting anew, I have confidence in my daughter, She's diligently juggling household chores, studies, and part-time work, learning from friends who are also living on their own. From this experience, she's learned that excessive kindness can sometimes harm oneself. We need to take care of ourselves first. It means you need to take care of yourself more, Mom. During her recent visit home, she shared these encouraging words. Hearing this, I felt moved by her maturity and reassured. Abby, glancing down, shyly shared. My goal now is to find someone wonderful. Someone who can have the kind of relationship you and Dad had. Toe, you think so? Exchanging looks, we couldn't help but smile. I know the future may hold many challenges. But with the support of the now reliable Abby, our parents, and those around us, I'm determined to live resolutely. I want to lead a life that would make my late husband proud.